loud.
It,
Well, it's October 3rd, 2019, and I have Bill Hettler in Minneapolis or St. Paul, which,
no, we actually live in a little town that's part of the Twin Cities. It's called Crystal, Minnesota. We're
okay,
about 8 minutes from downtown Minneapolis. So we're
all
just
right.
west and slightly north of the city. And we,
Right, I saw you on the map. In fact, I was over in Medicine Lake a couple months ago, and right along where you did that bike ride, you sent the map of. So,
yes, well, we bike around. That's one of my wife's favorite bike trails, where we bike from our house and go around Medicine Lake and then back. And it's quite a few hills. So it's for me, it's an unsupervised stress test every time we do it.
well, I suppose we should get down to business here.
Okay.
But now that we've determined where you are and that I know where you are, I'm in Novato, California, by the way.
And where is that?
In Marin County, just
okay, up near where your where your first wellness center was.
Yeah, Mill Valley's in southern Marin and Novato's in northern Marin.
Well,
so
I watched some of your other interviews, so I could kind of start by answering some of the questions you asked other people, and then you interrupt anytime you want me to do something different.
Well, I'm going to specifically focus on how you and I got hooked up back there in the 70s. And so why don't you take it away?
Okay, well, slight correction. It was not in San Francisco where you and I met. It was San Diego. And we met at the Society of Prospective Medicine meeting. And I remember sitting on the floor with you for over an hour, just chatting and sharing ideas. And Louis was there. And I have a picture from that day of you.
I have that picture too. I'll put it in.
Yeah, you and I and Louis Robinson.
Me towering over him. He was so tiny.
Yeah, you and Ardell always towered over me. So.
Well, you were in the middle range. Yeah, that's right. It was later at the Jack Tar that there was another meeting I saw you at, but it was San Diego. I remember a really sunny window, giant glass window. We were getting
exactly.
Toasted.
And you know, a number of their meetings, I don't know if you made some of them, were held at the Don Cesar Hotel in St. Petersburg. And
no, I only went to the Indianapolis ones.
Okay.
So how did you meet Louis? Let's back up to even that.
Well, let's back up further. Let's talk briefly about how I got interested in this stuff. We came at this from my Air Force career. I went directly to Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And the reason I went there was an environment there that was very supportive of what I thought I wanted to do with my life. And I had been tangentially touched by the idea of preventive medicine at my medical school graduation, where they rolled out this guy that none of us had ever seen to give the commencement address. His name was John Fair, Phair, full professor of preventive medicine. None of us had ever seen him in our 4 years of medical school. And I happened to be sitting in the front row, and the guy starts out by saying, "You boys," and by the way, there were only 2 women in our class out of 100.
About the same for me.
It was pretty accurate. He said, "You boys will save more lives and prevent more suffering if you never open a practice of medicine." Mm-hmm. And he went on to say, if you would just simply help people learn how to live their lives well, you will literally save more lives. Well, there were audible groans from all of us. and I might have been one of them who groaned. And he went on to spend the rest of that 40 minutes talking about what Louis Robbins was talking about. And they may have known each other. So I was not hooked in at that point, but I started to be challenged enough that while I was in the Air Force, I started thinking, you know, what we're doing here is not that great. And even though I was medical officer of the day and had to work the emergency room, and, you know, sure, we made a difference sometimes, but I was seeing the big picture even at that early stage. And I was so excited when I met the doctor who was the director of the health service from Stevens Point when I went to a college health meeting in Atlanta, Georgia. And he was telling me about what they were trying to do with helping students learn how to live their lives successfully. And I thought, man, this is a great opportunity. And I always wanted to teach. I enjoyed teaching. And so when they were interviewing me, they said, you could teach classes for credit and you could practice medicine. And so I jumped at the chance. I was in the Air Force and I could travel for free. In those days, all you had to do was wear your uniform and you could fly anywhere you wanted on an Air Force or commercial flight. And so,
commercial even, wow.
Yeah, and I wrote letters to all the colleges in the United States that I would consider living in that town. And these were all, you know, stamped envelopes. It's not email. We're talking real mail.
All right.
And I got 60 job offers in response.
Wow.
So then, because I was in the Air Force, I started flying around and looking at these places. And I was so impressed. It came down to Orono, Maine, or Stevens Point, Wisconsin. And I'm so glad I went to Stevens Point. And when I got there, I realized why Stevens Point was such a great choice. And it had nothing to do with the health center. It had to do with a president that had been there before, long before I got there. His name was James Albertson. And Albertson had this idea that a university should not just teach the courseware that was needed for whatever career pursuits people had, but a university should help students learn how to live their lives successfully. And he hired people in all of the areas of the student life that believed what he believed. And he said, you know, it's silly. The job's hard enough as it is. It's silly to hire people that are going to fight with you all the time. You might as well try to find people that, you know, believe what you believe. And so there were all these people there, Jack, who already believed in his philosophy. And so the head of the housing, the head of the food service, the head of the counseling center, the head of the placement and co-op center, all these people had been hired by him. And it was just like a beautiful milieu. It was a very, very cooperative group. And some of them had already been presenting at national conferences in their various fields of responsibility. And we had a guy come from Australia to visit us, and I have his book here. I still have his book. It's called The Magic Bullet. I don't know if you ever heard of that book.
No.
The subtitle is The Social Implications and Limitations of Modern Medicine. Incredible. Wow. And the guy's name was Brian Furness, and he heard about Stevens Point. He came to visit us. This was about 74, 75, right around the time a lot of things were happening. And you know the story of how Stevens Point found out about you. We had a nurse named Mary Fleischauer who had read about what you were doing somewhere, and our director at that time, Don Johnson, approved her travel out to, you know, visit your place. And she came back and she had this book with her. It wasn't this book, it was a notebook, but this was, you know, the wellness workbook. And that started all of us in learning more about what you were doing. Then there was this other guy, I don't know if you ever met him, from San Diego, a guy named Walter Sorokin. Have you ever met Walter?
No.
In 75, he published a big book called Personal Health Appraisal. And the book is just filled with personal assessment tools that individuals could do on their own, including longevity inventories. And I mean, it was amazing stuff to us. Well, about that same time, our director of our health service and I were investigating an alternative to the standard history and physical that was traditional in those days. All the schools in Wisconsin, and there were 23, you know, schools, all the schools required a standard history and physical, which in those days wasn't that expensive, but it was some serious money if you collectively did it for every student. And one of the things we investigated and used for a few years was something called the data automated student history. So as an alternative to a history and physical, we got permission from the Board of Regents to have our students fill out a like 700 item questionnaire.
Wow.
It was amazing. This was done by a company out of Ohio, out of near Cleveland, called Medical Datamation. And they were charged, they were charging, I don't know, $5 when they started. And since we were, one of the bigger schools using their materials, they would come and visit us every year and ask us, how can we make this better? And every year we would give them our best ideas, and then the next year they would charge our students more money. So we did that for a couple of years, and then that's when I started writing that lifestyle assessment questionnaire, which was very much reduced in number of items, but it was still a pretty large item for a student to fill out. But the beauty was we controlled almost every part of their lives. We controlled where they ate. We had controlled what kind of entertainment was brought to campus. We controlled the bars on campus. We controlled the counseling center. We controlled all of the other services, financial aid and all those things. So we could program whatever a student needed into our computer system, and it would print out personalized reports for these students. Whatever they asked for, whatever they said they wanted to learn, we could give them resources in 4 areas. We could give them, media, which was mostly books in those days. There were some movies or videotapes available and audio tapes. And then there were people, like community agencies in town that we could give them the name and phone number. You can call these people. And that was very successful for us. And it got, Stephen's point, an awful lot of attention in the college health field all over the country. And our people from all those various departments would present and tell them what we were doing. And you talk about a team effort. This was a fantastic team. These people all believed the same thing and were trying to do the same thing. And we would actually help each other if one unit was shorthanded or something, or needed, some equipment or materials. There was a lot of shifting of monies around because all of us reported to Fred Liefgren. He was the assistant chancellor. Right. So this was a beautiful system. Well, over the next few years, a lot of people kept asking if they could come and visit and see what we were doing. And that kind of led to greater justification in starting those conferences that we started. And that led to the big wellness conference eventually. The first 2 years, it was a small conference, mostly for teachers, that was run by Bob Bowen and myself. The big first national wellness conference was actually the 3rd conference. And so we called it the 3rd National Wellness Conference, even though the previous 2 were mostly our state and a few people from Minnesota. So it was a very, very exciting time for us. And having, people like Ardell, here's Ardell's revised book. That was his 10-year anniversary edition. And of course, eventually I got a hold of an actual Lewis Robbins, hardbound book from his collection of the lectures he gave in Arlington, Virginia.
I didn't know about them.
Yeah, and like you, every time I see one of his books for sale, I grab them. So I have a collection, maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 of the Halbert Dunn books. I just bought one last night, actually. After I watched one of your interviews, I checked to see if there were any available, and there was one. So I've got another one on the way.
Now, I've never seen a hardbound one.
Yeah, it's a nice dark little book, and there's the jacket. It has just that symbol that you're familiar with. Yeah.
I'll be darned.
So I've kept that. I used to give these. The Wellness Institute every year gives a Halbert Dunn Award to somebody who has contributed quite a bit to the goals and objectives of wellness in the view of the Stevens Point model. And so every year, whoever got it, I would give them a copy of his So I'm run out of the hardbound books now, but I have a lot of the paperback ones. So the progress that was made in Stevens Point was not just because of the university, but it was heavily influenced by the university. And I don't know if you remember this, but Wisconsin and California were leaders way before the other states in promoting wellness. And the reason it happened in Wisconsin was they formed what was called a wellness commission at the state level. And they allocated $1 million, Jack, for communities that could apply for grants. Well, throughout the state, over 300 groups were formed and had to learn enough about what wellness was so that they could apply for the money. And so there were huge numbers of people who were studying the materials that were given out as part of the grant making process. And it happened, Stevens Point got one of those grants. It was only like $30,000, you know, it wasn't a big deal. $1 million doesn't go that far. But what was interesting in Wisconsin, the money was enough of an incentive to get enough people to learn about wellness that most of them went ahead with their projects, even if they never got the grant, because it made so much sense to them. And so, you know, some of the big companies, Johnson Wax, Kimberly Clark, Century Insurance, they invested millions of dollars into programs for their employees. And that also was as an outcome of that initial seed money that the state provided to get a lot of people to learn about the value of a wellness model.
And did you have something to do with that material that they used to educate them?
I was part of the group that worked at the state level. We had a young man, a good friend of mine, who started out as a STD investigator in our county, and later he became the public health officer for our little town. And later he became, he was very, very bright. He became the head of all human services. And then he eventually was tapped to head all human services for the state of Wisconsin. So we had this one guy who was part of our community process, very good friends with lots of us. So we all had a lot of time together, running events, social events, parties for kids. A lot of our activities, we all had kids at that time. So there was a lot of, there was a running club one of our friends started called the Stevens Point Area Running Club, Spark. And they had over 150 kids who would enter NCAA races all over the state. And they would have to take 3 buses to go to these events. And they all had the same t-shirt. It was a pretty big deal. And all the parents of all those kids got to know each other. So there was quite a bit of communication going on informally that had nothing to do with organized stuff. It was just people getting together and having fun together.
Community.
Yeah, and community, and one of the things about the wellness conference, I had a very heavy hand in the first few years of that conference. And I insisted that we have a simultaneous program for children. Every time we had the adults together, we had to have something for children. So that continued, I'd say, for at least 35 years of my involvement there. And I still think it's an important thing that ought to be attempted. It may not make sense for some of these big hotel meetings, but for that kind of campus setting, that worked very well.
Well, and the other aspect of the community that was the campus itself and being in the dorms, and it was like summer camp, and we loved it. It's nothing now with the hotels. It's just the when we used to all eat in the big dining hall, and the meals were specially prepared. That sort of went downhill over the years, but the sense of community that was created there, I think, was half of the value of the conference.
Yeah, the first national conference we had, one of the speakers we brought in was a physician from Chicago who was a expert in nutrition. And unfortunately, the food service that day, I think we served them something like greasy meat in, fat or something. And he really took us to task. So starting that next year, we really paid attention to what foods were offered. We involved the food service in the planning, and we gave the audience members reports of how much fiber they had consumed, and we had to issue a fiber alert to the sewer department. You know, it was quite a change.
Yeah, I remember even we'd get a little lecture from someone in food service.
Yeah,
it was Allen Hall, I think, was where the
yeah, Allen Center, and that's still there, by the way.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you're right. Over the years, I think there's been less attention to that, especially as they moved away from the Stevens Point campus over to the Twin Cities.
Yeah, the campus made all the difference. And being on a dorm, we brought a whole floor full at once. We all on the same dorm, and great fun.
Yeah, you had your own little community within the big community.
Yeah. Now, going back a bit, how did you connect with Louis Robbins? That's in all of that.
As part of that medical datamation company, they were interested in the health risk appraisal or health hazard appraisal that Louis had done, and they had built some of that into their system. And so that got some of us to go to the Society of Prospective Medicine meetings, and I became very involved. I kept trying to push them to do more with the programming end on the other end. But the people who were part of that society, for the most part, they were people interested in knowing whether it was 3.5 times more risky or 3.6 times more risky to do whatever it was. And I kept saying, look, all right, it's more risky. Now what are we going to do? You know, and I kept trying to push that. And I actually became their president at one point. But I just couldn't move it. The herd was just too thick for me to move them to more of a wellness thing. And so I got involved with other groups. One group that was very important is that AFB, which then changed their name to the American Association of Fitness Directors in Business and Industry, FDIBI, but they started out as American Fitness and Business. And that group was a very powerful group, and they continued to make an influence in our country. Through them, I learned about WELCOA. I think WELCOA has probably had more impact in the last 10 years than any other single organization because of their awards program. The awards program, it's worth looking up and seeing, you know, how people are rated and what kind of programming is offered that wins awards. And what is interesting to me is, though, California and Wisconsin, their companies get most of the awards every year. And it has to do with that original seed money, I think. And, you know, California had that California Wellness Council that funded a lot of projects. So those two states stand out in the United States as having invested small amount of money relatively early at the right time, in my view, when the projections of the cost of disease care was, you know, going to be astronomical, and then it became more than astronomical. It became super astronomical.
And getting bigger every day.
It sure is.
So you actually met Louis at one of the meetings, or?
Oh yeah. Well, no, I personally just drove down there one time and decided I got to meet this guy. And Jack Hall was a lot more, I guess, business oriented. Louis was more big picture and trying to get doctors to do what he wanted everybody to do. And he had more time too. Jack was still a busy practitioner in the.
Well, he was head of a department too, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I got to visit Louis right at his house, sit down and talk to him. I saw the little path he had worn in his backyard for his.
Oh yeah, that path, his little fitness trail. Yeah.
Do you remember that?
I remember that.
I think he must have done maybe a quarter mile a day or something, but
yeah,
it was regular.
So.
And all through the same time, I was heavily involved in the YMCA movement. For 35 years, I was involved on the board of directors of the group over those years, it went by different names, but it became the Medical Advisory Committee of the YMCA of the USA. And that kept me in touch with what was going on. That's a very large, organization with facilities everywhere, and they're very focused on community. And so I stayed with that group until I retired from the university.
I remember you brought us all to Frost Valley that summer too. And,
well, yeah, that's an interesting story. I I started going to the YMCA as a 9-year-old kid. I would go from school to the Y, and I was on the swim team and on a gymnastic team. And one of the guys that was a youth director when I first started going there at the Youngstown Y. By the way, to get to the Y, you had to take the bus from school downtown Youngstown, Ohio, and then you had to walk past the burlesque theater to get to the Y, because the bus stop was right on the other side of the burlesque theater. And so that was always interesting for all these young kids getting off the bus and going over to the Y. But
yeah.
The guy who was the youth director later became the waterfront director at the Y camp I went to every year, starting at age 9, and that's up on Lake Erie. And the Youngstown YMCA owned this. They own a mile of Lake Erie frontage, and this guy eventually became the director of that camp. And I always told him, because while he was moving up through the ranks, I was moving up from dish crew to counselor to village chief to waterfront director. And I always told him, if you ever need a doctor, after I get done with my medical training, I'll be your camp doctor. Well, it didn't happen right away, but later in his career, he was sent to Frost Valley, and he took the director job there. And that's a camp that had 500 kids every 2 weeks, plus 200 kids out on trips every 2 weeks. And so it was a huge operation, and they could afford to hire a doctor. So I actually spent 6 weeks every summer for 6 summers out there as their camp doctor. And that's when we invited, the first year I went there, I was shocked by how little attention there was to the kids' lives and their activities. And there was no focus on trying to, build a healthier child out of the process. So we started talking about it on the way home that first summer. I wrote a lengthy letter suggesting a lot of changes, some of which were not appreciated by the existing staff. But I sent a copy of my letter to him and to his board of directors, which was a dirty trick, but they bought it. And we actually were able to form a group, and Bob Allen got involved in that. And I happen to have right here, I have the original kit that we got a foundation called the Victoria Foundation, somewhere in New Jersey, who funded a kit that was given out at the American Camping Association meeting that was held in Boston that year. And they printed about 400 of these kits that included slides, audio tape, booklets, handouts, and materials for parents, materials for the administration of the camps. And so in one fell swoop, we kind of attacked the entire camping movement through it was a $30-some thousand grant from the Victoria Foundation to fund this. And that helped with all the planning to get, remember when you and Don Ardell and Bob Allen and a whole bunch of people came out there, while you were there, you were meeting with people from Newark, New Jersey. And these were where most of the parents came from for the low income kids that went to that camp. And so they actually planned to meet with families after camp. And it was a very, I think, extended program that went on for years. And I still think it's going on there. Some of the changes have faded away, but they still have very good attention to the nutrition. And it was a good experience for all of us, I think.
Great. Well, jumping back to the conference again, I'm just remembering the time you invited me out there. Was it 78, I think, summer of 78.
Well, it turns
Was
out
one.
you're on this poster behind me. Let me look and just see what year it was. John Travis. That one was 1986, Jack.
No, but I came earlier. I came in 78, and it was a small group. And
Oh, that wasn't the wellness conference, Jack. That that's when you got me in trouble.
yes.
That was when we invited, obviously, the student organizations and all the university people that were interested. We invited all them, but I also invited all the doctors in town. There were only about 30 doctors in town at that time. I invited them all to come and hear you lecture. And at some point in your lecture, you started talking about out-of-body experiences using ketamine and something. And oh man, it set us back with those guys for quite a while.
And now 40 years later, ketamine is in the news.
Yeah, now it's back in the news. That's right. Unfortunately. Yeah, but that, what you presented was very good for us and our staff and our students. But I think it didn't make the leap I was hoping for with our local guys.
So that wasn't an actual conference. I thought.
No, that was not. That was just we regularly brought in speakers, that would help sustain us and help keep us at the what we thought was the cutting edge, and you were the cutting edge, whether you liked it or not.
A little too sharp for that group.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
So then another conference event I remember was in the gymnasium, and you had just given a big keynote on environmental stuff, which I had been talking about years earlier.
Sure.
And I remember you came up to me afterwards and said, you were talking about this a long time ago, and I hadn't gotten it. It felt pretty black.
Well, it took me a long time to learn a lot of things, but when you start having kids and you start thinking about their future, and at that point I had 6, and I'm looking at this world, and so the name of that presentation was called "The World of Wellness and the Wellness of the World," and I actually created a 6-dimensional model for the wellness of the world that included all the things that are essential to keep humans alive, like air that you can breathe, water that you can drink, energy sources that don't kill you. I mean, it's all laid out, and I still have that. The outline of that presentation is still on my webpage somewhere.
Mm. Yeah. That was one of the many encounters over the years with.
Yeah. One of my sons, Adam, is a very strong advocate for environmental issues. As a matter of fact, he's on his way back from protesting with, that Swedish young woman, Greta?
Yeah.
Yeah, he met her, and he went all the way to New York to see her, and then he saw her somewhere else too. But he's on his way back now. He's actually heading for Cleveland next, and then he'll be back here on Wednesday of next week. But he and his mom and dad do a lot of protesting for climates, and we are frequently in St. Paul with groups of people trying to bring about change, especially with the climate.
Yeah, the strike last week, I went to the local one here, and it was disappointing turnout, but my granddaughters down at a private school in Mill Valley, they all marched to the pavilion in Mill Valley. So that school was participating.
Well, my wife and I marched here, and my grandson and granddaughter marched in Boston. And there was a huge crowd of kids in Boston.
My 26-year-old daughter got arrested outside of Sydney for 9 of them chained themselves in a sheep slaughterhouse. She's a vegan activist. Point both of animal cruelty, but also that cows are one of the biggest methane producers, and methane's way more potent than CO2 is, and it gets glossed over completely.
Yeah, one of the doctors I worked with, Jim Zock.
Oh yeah, I know
when he
him.
was in college, he and some friends changed themselves to some walnut trees at Whitewater's campus, and they got quite a bit of attention. I got in trouble once for protesting when I was in the Air Force in Fairborn, Ohio. A bunch of my friends and I were part of an anti-war protest, and unfortunately our pictures were in the local newspaper, and we all had our uniforms on, so we were marching in this anti-war protest, and we were called in to the hospital commander, who threatened to send us to Vietnam if we ever did anything like that again. And I was scared enough I didn't protest in uniform anymore. So,
well, I got to wear my public health service uniform and sit in the choir loft of the National Cathedral when they had that big action, and they camped in the mall in DC.
Yeah.
And, that was it was a military protest against the war in Vietnam at that point. So Ohio wasn't quite there yet.
Right.
Speaking of Ohio, both you and I and Louis were all born in Halbert were born in Ohio, though Halbert moved to Minnesota, where his family was actually from. They were just visiting grandparents in New Paris. But
well, so, we sure enjoy this this part of the world. The bike trails and the water. You have to go north to get into some really good woods. But my wife and I, we've only been here 5 years, so we've been exploring the state. Just the other day, we went to the Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. It's about 45 minutes northwest of here, and we saw huge numbers of trumpeter swans. And I just happened to have my camera out, and I was shooting some video. You know how the trumpeters are the ones where they do this elaborate neck motions that mimic each other. It's really cool. I put it up on my SmugMug website. When we're done talking, I'll send you the link to just that short video. But it's so amazing to watch them. And there were pelicans, white pelicans. There were all kinds of other birds, of course, but it's just a huge area.
Well, another area where our paths crossed it took me a while to get caught onto it when I moved into infant wellness, was carrying babies. And you were carrying babies around the conference way before I knew how important it was.
You know, it's interesting. A woman at the American College Health Association, you know, I was voted in as a fellow of that organization as one of the honors I got. But apparently at one of the conferences, I actually had a kid sitting on my shoulders for an entire presentation. I had no memory of it, but she sent me the picture. Little kid drooling on my head.
Yeah, that contact and movement is so crucial. And
yeah, right before I came down here, I had the 6-week-old on my chest upstairs. My daughter-in-law stopped over today, and anytime she stops over, I love the time.
Oh yeah, that's.
You know, it's so nice having. We've got 3 grandkids now that are within a mile of the house, so it's very easy to. The 2-year-old loves to go for bike rides with me, and pretty soon her little brother, who's 6 months old, I'll be putting both of them in a bike buggy and taking them on bike rides. I have something that I watched your interview with Don Ardell, and I want to share something that happened to me, much like what happened to you. You apparently went to try to run with him one time.
I ran part of his first 5K. I ran 1K with him.
Well, one of those times we were at Frost Valley, he said, "Hey, I'm going to go for a run down to the nearest town," which was Claryville, New York, which was 7 miles away, by the way. And I said, "Don, I can't run with you. I'm not that fast. You know, you're a world-class runner, and I am a slogger. You know, I'm a slow jogger." And he said, "Well, listen," he said, "I'll run whatever pace you want, what can you do? And I said, well, Don, you can't slow down that slow. I run about 7-minute miles at that point in my life. And so he says, Bill, I'm a world-class athlete. I can run 7-minute miles if I want to. So I said, okay, I'll go with you. So we start out down the road, Jack, and we get maybe a half a mile, and I'm sucking air, you know, and I can't keep up. And I just said, go ahead, Don. I just can't do it. And he just a little bit further down the road, he got to the mile marker, and he looks at his watch. He always had one of those fancy watches, you know. He turns around, 5:20. So he was running 5:20 pace, and I'm trying to keep up. And it was not my thing, I'll tell you.
Too much.
Yeah.
Well, now, how did you and Don first meet?
I think it was at our conference. We had read about, I think we had bought his book, his first book. And I think we invited him to come up to the conference, or we might have brought him like we did for you, you know, just to be a presenter for the faculty and staff. Because at the same time all this was going on, I was working to try to get a new wellness major at that university. They didn't have one when I started there. And so anytime I could, you know, do something to expand the appreciation for what was possible, I would do it. And I was a very good speaker, and I had keynoted many conferences all over our state and other states. And our chancellor at the time was also a very powerful public speaker. Eventually he became the governor of the state, and he happened to run into me somewhere, and he gave me the freedom. He said, Bill, I want you on the road as much as you're willing to do it. And so I might have run into Don at another conference somewhere, but I'm pretty sure we invited him in because we were trying to, you know, move this. We had a department that had a bunch of old white guys who didn't like to teach anymore and didn't like students very much. And it was really bad. And so over time, we were able to change the faculty actual staffing of that department. And they now have the premier undergraduate program in wellness and health promotion in the country.
Wow. Now, where does Elaine fit into this?
Oh, Elaine is such a wonderful, wonderful story and addition. Elaine was a hall director in Stevens Point. She was one of the hall directors that worked for Fred Liefgren. And later, you know, she became a nun. And then she decided she didn't want to be a nun anymore and married Joe. And
I thought the nunning was before she got to Stevens Point. I didn't.
Well, it might have been, and it might have been her first job after she left being a nun. Yeah, that's very possible because she wasn't our typical hall director. You know, usually they were master's level people, but she was a little bit older and wiser. But later, you know, she became a very active member of the board of directors of the Wellness Institute, and I thought was a very important addition because it was just these three white guys for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I always remember her saying that she was doing penance for all those years she made students sit in rows and be quiet.
Yeah, that might be. She, you know, she and Don used to go at it quite a bit. His strong secular nature and her, she's a very spiritual minded person who has great tolerance for whatever people believe. And Don would constantly be picking on her and trying to instigate some kind of conflict, you know, of discussion, but it worked out. I mean,
yeah.
But she brought good balance. She brought good balance, and other women later, you know, who, I don't know if you knew it. At one point, Sandy Queen was the president of the early organization. It was called, originally it was called the Organization of Wellness Networks, and Sandy was involved from the beginning at that level, and later, you know, we had Meg Jordan as a member of the board, and we had some very good women involved over the years in that board of directors.
Yeah, I think I was the one that brought Meg to the first conference because she was part of our network, and now she's a neighbor. I'm going to be seeing her tomorrow afternoon.
Well, that's great.
I'm going to interview her. Now, Ann Abbott was in that picture too. Where did she?
Yeah, Ann Abbott, she came to Stevens Point as part of the improvement of that faculty I was telling you about.
Uh-huh.
And she was very, very instrumental in helping build that undergraduate training program. She came out of Pittsburgh. She worked at a hospital, right. And I met her there. She actually had me come and present at her hospital one time. And that's, I think, the first connection I had with her.
Uh-huh. Wow. The good old days.
Yeah.
So where do you think it's going, Bill?
Well, I'm very optimistic that the youth of our country are starting to get engaged in things that are important. And I think it's a good sign. I'm very, very positive about the approach that WELCOA has taken. I encourage you to check out their webpage and see what their award system looks like. You know, it's a lot of ups and downs, as most things have been, but the word wellness is used completely wrong most of the time. But in the big picture of things, I think it's moving forward.
Good. And any ideas for your participation beyond what you're doing already?
Well, my goal right now is to continue to gather all my materials together and try to find a place for them before I die. And maybe you and Don should be doing the same thing. And
well, this project is part of that, but I don't have probably the number of materials that you have.
Well, I have a lot of videos, and I sent you a link to, I have a Smug Mug site where I put my, family pictures mostly, but occasionally I put other things there. And I had a bunch of interviews from one of the earliest wellness conferences. And I sent you a link to that page. And they're just short videos. People like Elaine Sullivan, Tom Ferguson, Don Ardell when he was a young, hip and sexy guy. It would be fun for you, I think, to look at those.
Especially if you have Tom, because I, don't have him, obviously. He died, 15 years ago.
Right. Well, Tom and I and Don Kemper would do these little retreat things. Tom married into a very wealthy family down in north of Houston. They had a 5,000 acre ranch. And so Tom and Don and I met there, and we would do brainstorming to essentially help build Healthwise into whatever it could be. And
great.
That was a very positive thing. And then Tom and I, his wife and my wife, we did a 7-day snout boat trip down the Colorado River, where every day we had time to just, take side hikes because the river was running so fast that year. So I really had a great relationship with him. He and I were avid ping pong players, and he and I would play games like my brother and I used to play, where we could play for hours, best of 21, best of 21 games, not 21 points. And that ranch they had was an amazing place. And he had one of those ultra expensive, fancy ping pong tables out there. It was a nice opportunity for us to get away from the people asking you questions all the time and just share ideas.
I wonder, Tom helped put me on the map too, because he had moved to California the same time I did. And, I remember he got me in a program in San Diego. We flew down to San Diego together, and then he wrote me up in the American Medical Association journal.
He helped us get started with the first health informatics conference. We ran a health informatics in Stevens Point, and he helped helped us with contacts. Michael McGinnis, do you remember Michael McGinnis?
I know the name, but I
And
don't remember him.
all the people from the CDC that were interested in health informatics. He had firsthand, communication with them all the time.
Right, that was his big next thing after Medical
right.
Healthcare magazine. Yeah. So I wonder who other people we had in common back there that I'm not remembering or knowing about.
Well, you and I and Dawn, I think we're very fortunate. We were given the opportunity to travel around to a lot of conferences and meet a lot of different talented people. I think I had the best of all worlds because we ran this conference, for 40 years where we brought many, many really talented people together where there was a lot of sharing of ideas and challenges. I thought it was a very powerful experience.
Yeah. Yeah. You being an extrovert, it was perfect.
Yeah.
Plus you had a day job and you had an income. I was struggling at near poverty levels for most of my career.
Yeah.
I had a lot of freedom.
You have a lot in common with Patch Adams. He always struggled with that, because he always felt like, and as I guess he was, the main revenue stream to get that thing going and keep it going for a long time.
Yeah.
And the other beautiful thing for the conference was just the social stuff. Remember, we were in charge of the entertainment, so we could have whatever kind of entertainment we wanted. And that was also a very positive thing for us.
And the talent shows were one of the winners.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Back on Sandy Queen, speaking of talent shows, how did you hook up with her? Was she always in Columbia or was she there?
Her name was given to us as a potential speaker one year, early on. And the reason was she had written a book, Wellness for Children.
Yeah.
And that was my focus. I was in that business full time personally. And so as soon as I found out about her, we made arrangements to get her to this point. Mm-hmm. So a book can make a big difference. So.
Yeah. Well, have we exhausted the?
Well, the other big thing that happened for Stevens Point was Good Morning America decided to come and do a week-long series about Stevens Point. And
the whole campus or the wellness?
It was for our community. The campus was heavily featured, but they also included the programs that we had running for senior citizens in our community. Oh. And the stuff we were doing in the grade schools. We had Ardell come to meet with grade school kids one time just to do some, boosting of that incentive. Mm-hmm. And then because of that, you know how much attention you got from that 60 Minutes thing.
Very little, actually.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah.
We got a lot of attention, but then later, it was interesting. They decided to do a week-long series about wellness that included a health quiz every day. And they used as their on-camera host, Bruce Jenner. And so they hired this young man named David Sloan to be the producer of the show. But unfortunately, David got mononucleosis. So I ended up writing most of that week's, that whole series about who the talent was going to be besides Bruce. And, we had like David Danskin on his mini stress management techniques. And it was a week-long series. And every day there was when? Probably in the 80s, 86, somewhere around there. I have all the footage. What was interesting, I was in New York where they interviewed me live a couple times, and the offices of Good Morning America were the shabbiest, dirtiest, stinky places I've ever seen. And, like you talk about Dilbert kinds of arrangements with all these cubicles. And well, anyway, I go there after they had, done the editing on all the footage they shot in our town. and they actually let me take the original tapes, Jack. I walked out of the office with 2 big shopping bags full of all the raw materials from all the shows that they shot.
Wow.
I copied them, down to 3/4 inch because they were 1-inch stuff, and I copied them down and I gave them to the Institute. I don't know if they still have them or not, but there was quite a bit of extra footage shot because they shot, I think, something like 8 hours of tape for the first show, and it was only on 5 minutes and 26 seconds. So
yep.
Some heavy editing took place.
Yeah. Well, any other closing remarks before we
I would just, it's interesting that Don has, he's always been revising his way of splitting up wellness and describing it. He's gotten so heavily involved with the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Robert Ingersoll orations. He still competes, I think, for these orations. Yeah. But his most recent thing of dividing wellness into just 4 areas that make sense to him, that 6-dimensional model is still holding its own pretty well. And I still love what Robert Allen said. He said, the most important wellness model is the one you actually use.